Welcome to the Critical Few Actions to Improve Your Business podcast. I'm John Downs and I'm here to help you cut through the overwhelm and prioritise what matters most to improve your business. Let's get started and discover the critical few actions that have the biggest impact. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Kate Whitehead, who I believe is one of Australia's top experts on government grants, which to apply for, how to apply for them, how to increase your success rate, and how to meet the compliance obligations once you're successful. I met Kate recently through one of my CEO Masterclass graduates who has successfully worked with Kate over the last 4 years to seek government grant investment support at a state and a federal level to rapidly scale their innovation, their R&D, to embrace Industry 4.0 manufacturing capability, and to accelerate their export market potential. Kate, welcome.
Thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it.
Absolute delight, Kate. So tell me, today we're going to talk about how medium business founders and CEOs can seek government funding support to help them grow and diversify their businesses. But first, tell me a bit about your career journey into creating Advant Group. How did you first get interested in writing grants, and how did that journey evolve?
I think it was one of those things that a lot of businesses sort of fall into the trap of. You sort of fall into your career in a certain way. So my background in my very early career, I was working at the Victorian Chamber of Commerce. So whilst I was there, I saw the policy-driven side of government grants and lobbying done from industry sort of pushing through to government. And then in my later career, I worked for over a decade in the defence and aerospace sector. Now, that is an area that's obviously a high priority for sovereign capability from the government. Whilst working in that sector, learnt and understood a lot about government grants, was involved in some collaboration work across organisations, bringing together industry capability team network activities and lobbying, and also running some pretty complex collaboration grants during that time. So that sort of enabled me to get the skills and to learn, because this is a very niche, unique space we operate in.
Yeah.
And then that sort of evolved into Advant Group, which was founded in 2012. So quite a few years ago now, where we now deal with an array of different programs, from grants, non-dilutive grants, through to research and development tax incentive programs and export programs.
And in the context of medium business, what is the context behind government offering grants to businesses? What's their objectives? Is it just free money for all? And how do they maximise the value return from the public spend?
Yeah, it'd be nice if it was free money for all, but it's not quite that easy. And it really depends. So the government has priority sectors for investment. So that's areas that they focus on. And it could be their social side of world, where they see there's a social need. So things like housing support, not-for-profit activities, so mental health in youth, those sorts of programs. There's a lot of government funding. And that's really around those society-based outcomes, where they look at it and say, we need to support these sectors and these functions across our organisation or around our country. On the other side of the world, you then look at the business style of grants and programs, and that's really where the government wants to focus on sovereign capability and developing certain industry sectors that are deemed as important. And they're often underpinned by policy and a political agenda. So things such as, as I mentioned earlier, defence, that's an area that gets a lot of focus. At the moment, we've also got a Labor government that's focused heavily on net zero and, green energy transition. So we're seeing a lot of funding towards those sorts of policies. So government grants, they require an output. So the government won't just fund things for the sake of funding it, and they look for economic benefit and a return on that economic benefit. So the broad-ranging programs, so things that we see, such as your small export grants schemes or your EMDG, that has a measurable impact, and the government releases the measured impact on the economic multiplier that particular program provides. And it's, that's a 50-year program. So arguably one of the most successful in history. And for every dollar spent, it generates $2.10 in additional export income and up to $7 on an economic multiplier. Wow. So it's measured and it's maintained and managed from that perspective, because it is, all of that funding gets reviewed as a result of being spent.
Let's get into a case study. I mean, this client that we share, SOSUB, and they've given us permission to talk about this. Tell us a little bit about their journey that's worked with you.
So they're a really interesting dynamic business. So it's a business that's being run by, very intelligent, technically skilled personnel, and they've invested heavily into their underlying technology. So in the first instance, if an Australian-based company is investing in novel research and development activities, there are some very significant tax-based programs that they can avail themselves of to help with those cash flows in those early years. So the main program that's available is called the Research and Development Tax Incentive.
Mm.
The program provides a cash refund on money spent on eligible R&D activities. So work being undertaken to develop novel products would be eligible, and it's a very broad-ranging program. So it'll help fund everything from base salaries plus superannuation, payroll tax, through to percentage of rent, prototyping costs, engineering time, computer usage utilization, machine utilization. So anything that can
Production
be
trials, just a
yeah,
raft.
absolutely.
It's
It's
massive.
never ending. Yeah, as long as it's directly attributable to the research and development efforts and the underlying project meets the legislative requirements, and that is a brilliant program. And literally for every dollar you spend, you get a 43.5% refund, cash refund on that funding spent in those pre-revenue stages. So it is, in those earlier years when you are investing heavily and you haven't got the revenue coming in the door, this is one of the most generous programs globally that you can access and avail yourselves of. So that's definitely one that's worth looking at, and one that we've worked with SOSUB over the years in helping them to access this scheme. Because it is a tax-based program, it's subject to audit, as it should be. So that means that, maintaining, really strong compliant documentation is critical, because in the instance of an audit, you need to be able to defend the claim and the value of the claim. So we work with them on making sure that they've got their timesheets in place, that their technical investigation reports are completed, that their project updates and all the appropriate documentation's maintained. So that's a very high touch, but high valuable engagement where we're constantly working with the team and making sure that we've got that compliance in place. Beyond that, then SOSUB also received it doesn't exist anymore, but it's been rebadged under a new program. But in its old days, it was called the Accelerating Commercialisation Program, and the organisation was successful for a $1 million grant. So that's a competitive grant. Now the AC has since been replaced by the Industry Growth Program. And this is a very generous, again, but extremely competitive grant that helps organisations to commercialise in those early stages. So this provided them with $1 million of non-dilutive funding to help invest on scaling their manufacturing capability for their drones. So for those that don't know SOSUB, it might be worth me sort of flagging that they've developed and please have a look at their website, because they really do have an amazing product. They've developed an underwater drone that is piloted through a tether and a very complex camera system, and it will actually stitch underwater nets in fish farming environments. So particularly we've got some very big markets in Australia, but they're also a fabulous export success where they're now selling into Norway and a number of other European countries where there's large fish farming activities, particularly for salmon and trout. And also up north, they're doing Humpty Doo barramundi, for example.
Yeah.
So their drones can actually they travel along the exterior of these nets and they identify where there's a hole in the net, and then it'll come along with a crimping stitching program and then sort of robotically stitch the net together. And it's got a huge environmental impact, which is positive as well, because the amount of seals that unfortunately get into those nets, once they're in the nets, you can't get them out. So it stops the seals from getting in and having an absolute feast.
Yeah, it's the best fast food restaurant you'll ever
Ready-made
find underwater.
sashimi, they get in there and they've got a big smile on their face, but unfortunately you can't get them out. So, it solves all these problems. So amazing.
And in fact, actually, they just last week, they won the National Innovation Award.
They did.
For Industry 4.0 technologies, and that was an extraordinary feat.
Huge win.
A massive win for them. Yeah.
And not their first win. They've won multiple awards over the years, which is quite amazing. So that really great business, and as I said, run by some very sort of switched on operators and technically skilled personnel. So that Accelerating Commercialisation grant that helped scale and really. They sort of talk about it in business cycles. They call it the critical valley of death, which is a bit of a horrible name. I'm sure you'd be well across these terms, John, but this grant helps to fill that void. So they were able to access, that $1 million in funding. And then the next stage from there was export grants. So the EMDG, that'll provide them up to 8 years of funding for them to go overseas and sell their systems into these European countries. So they've been accessing that. And as I mentioned before, the EMDG directly gives a positive output for economic multipliers for the Australian economy. So SOSUB's one of those examples. They're doing it already, right? So they're traveling, they're selling overseas, they're proving the value in that program.
And they're
the
creating
EMDG
amazing sovereign capability in their manufacturing.
absolutely.
And it
Yeah.
is a world first. I mean, they've just come back from Aquanor, which is the Norwegian aquaculture trade show. It's the most significant international trade show for the aquaculture industry, and it was well and truly seen as being a world first.
Yeah. So it's phenomenal. Like they've got this novel product, it's patented, and the market application's huge. So there's Norway, Scotland. So they're sort of targeting these regions and using the programs to help get them over there. Because again, in those early stages of a business, management of cash flow and strategic investment is critical. Otherwise, you can have a great product but run out of cash. So these programs help to defray those costs and support that founder journey. So EMDG has been one that obviously we continue to assist them with. And obviously, whilst this is all going, they're still developing new product ranges. So they're still claiming the research and development tax incentive. And then the next program from there is we've been able to also support with some state-based programs. So, for example, there was a manufacturing grant from the Tasmanian government. The Tasmanian government has a really nice program that they open regularly with batched funding to help support manufacturing capability in Tassie. And they're a really good department to deal with. We find them really easy to deal with and they're quick. So you lodge an application and they assess them quickly and they release the funding quickly. So if you are Tassie-based, then that's one to certainly look at, advanced manufacturing. And then beyond that, there's been the little bits and bobs along the way. So one such example, there was a $25,000 energy efficiency grant, and that was for upgrading energy efficient equipment at their manufacturing site. So we were able to get them access to that, and that was 100% funded. So there's been some large scale grants, and then there's also been a watchful eye over the smaller scale programs as they tick along and grow their business.
And Kate, you mentioned the word before, non-dilutive. What do you mean by that?
So government grants don't take a shareholding in a business. So in a normal environment, to get funding, you have to go out, sell shares or take debt, which means giving away a piece of the business. Whereas a government grant is really the strategic number one priority that any business should be looking for because it's non-dilutive. We are seeing a shift from the government into more of these sort of quasi-grant/investment programs. So Victoria had one which was called the Breakthrough Victoria. We're also seeing it from the federal government under the National Reconstruction Fund, where they're actually utilising, in the most part, superannuation funds, putting some government backing behind it, but taking investment stakes into business. So that is another option for funding. However, we would always take a preference for a non-dilutive government grant as opposed to an investment.
And so, Kate, how common is this? I mean, who are the typical businesses that government seeks to support?
So there are the usual suspects, I would say, and the government actually publishes these priority sectors. So they are sectors that include, as I mentioned earlier, defence and space, medical technologies and pharmaceuticals, advanced manufacturing. We see a lot in tourism as well. So, trying to drive increased inbound tourism and also intrastate tourism across the country. You see food manufacturing. The agricultural supply chain is a key area of priority for the government. Transport technologies and also mining and equipment as well. So these are the key sectors that if you're operating within them or within the supply chains for those sectors, you're more likely to receive government funding. But it's not to say that you won't get funding if you're doing other activities. Having said that, there are some sectors that are notoriously difficult to get funding for, and they are sectors where realistically they probably don't need the stimulus. So things such as, real estate, commercial real estate, property development, there's very, very little to no government funding there, unless, again, it's attached to one of those social outcomes that I mentioned before. So, if it's around jobs placement, then there would be some government funding. Traditional high street retail is typically hard. There are some small council-based programs, $5,000, $10,000 for, facelifts of shops and whatnot, but on the larger scale, they're harder. So the government looks for what they call value-added activities and not BAU, which is business as usual. So waking up, turning on the lights and starting a business and just continuing ticking along isn't the sort of thing that gets funding. It's got to be something that's an enabler, whether it's a technology investment or increasing exports or increasing job volumes. That's the sort of activities that gets funded.
And is it large or small or massive businesses that are more in the target range, or is it really peculiar to the grant?
So that's a very good question. So in the most part, it's SMEs. So it's an SME is defined as, for government grants purposes, as 200 or less employees. There are some funding sort of levels, which certain programs, or I should say turnover levels, which certain programs knock you out of once you hit above those. So for example, the export grant, $20 million, anything above that, less likely to get funding, or so ineligible under EMDG, but less likely to get funding under more general programs. And it is one of those things, if we see a P&L where turnover is $35 million and the profit's $7.2 million and they're asking for a $50,000 grant, chances are they're not going to get the funding, because it's competitive.
Because they can effectively actually fund it.
Yeah, well, they know you're going to do it anyway. So they'll look for those businesses that need the support, which I think is fair. So smaller size businesses. Having said that, with the net zero transition, that has opened up some larger scale funding for larger businesses. So heavy emitters, large scale battery supply chains, solar manufacturing chains. So they're not completely knocked out, but the general programs, they're knocked out because they're bigger, but there are some very specific but very large scale grants designed for those that sort of larger end of town as well.
Yeah. And that's really to make a substantial shift in an industry as such, or to meet a specific government objective.
That's exactly right. So it's aligned to that policy and the promises that they make when they head into the election and get our votes. So it's delivering on those promises. So that's where we're seeing, and we are seeing some really impactful large-scale funding in, coming out of ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is good.
Yeah. And so it's not quite as simple as filling out a form online and then money cascades into your bank account, is it?
Oh, if it was, I wouldn't exist. I don't think so. No, it's not. Look, it depends on the program. There are some grants which you can do yourself. They're small, they're fill in a form. It's, so some of those, I'm just thinking of examples, when there's been reactions to, environmental problems or disasters where, there's some small stimulus that goes out. But in the most part, a government grant is complex. And depending on the scale of what you're asking for, the complexity increases exponentially. So it could be something from, a technical write-up, but then it's understanding the underlying policy. And then it's also supporting with some of the other documents. And that could be feasibility studies, project plans, cash flow modelling, three-way modelling. So there's a number of additional documents that are prepared, risk analysis that support the assessment of the government in determining who should get the funding. Once you've got the funding, I always say that's actually the easy part, believe it or not. You've then got to deliver on it. So delivering on that means ensuring that milestones are lodged on time, that the project's being tracked appropriately and in compliance with the grant agreement. And many of the grants also have an end of project audit. So all of that process can be quite onerous on small businesses. So it's about making sure the systems are set up early on. And we help businesses through that journey to help them maintain that compliance and also ensure that the documentation, the reporting is compliant with their agreement.
Yeah, look, I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned that can be quite onerous for small businesses. The reality is when we look at upper, medium and large businesses, when they're putting in a capital expenditure request, and they're making board level decisions about should they invest in this or should they invest in that, they actually go through that sort of standard sort of process whereby they look at, what's the impact on our profitability, what's the impact on our profit and loss, cash flow, balance sheet, and so on. And then they actually do the review of what are the anticipated benefits, and they go through the process of actually then doing a post-implementation review to assess whether or not they achieve the outcomes that they'd expected, and so on. So whilst many small businesses and lower medium businesses would look at this and say, gee, this is really onerous. Well, the reality is it's actually good practice. Yes, it's government mandated, so people think that's a waste of time, but the reality is it's actually good practice. And so getting into that habit of actually having a plan as to what you plan to do, a set of clear objectives, having good record keeping for it, and then actually a review as to whether or not you achieved your outcomes is actually just good practice. And so you can imagine that any of the tier one media reporters having a look at a grant that was acquitted and went feral, they'd have a field day if it looked like the government actually wasn't looking after the public's money carefully. So, I get that winning the grant is only the easy bit, and following through on it is absolutely the hard bit, not just from actually delivering what you said you were delivering, but also being able to demonstrate that you did. So I think that's sort of an important process, but it's actually good for the business.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they might be brought kicking and screaming to that level of sophistication, but it's actually a good process for them to get involved with. Are you looking to pinpoint the areas that will make the biggest impact on your business? Check out the Organisation Performance and Value Diagnostic. This powerful tool lets you evaluate your business on multiple facets and provides email reminders to keep you on track. Head over to CriticalFewActions.com.au and get started now. So if I'm applying for a grant, what are the keys to being successful and not wasting a huge amount of time on something that I'm not likely to be successful for anyway?
So there's two things that we look for before we would proceed with a government grant. The first one is fitment. So does the project align with, and does the organisation's reputation align with the merit criterion that the government grant's trying to fund? So, holistically, does this project fit what the funding's trying to achieve? And the outcomes are always identified and articulated. So there's that fitment piece. And then the other one, which is probably the simplest one to start off with, is eligibility. I know it sounds crazy, but, checking eligibility up front. So it is the very first thing that an assessor will do when they're looking at an applicant is, are they eligible or are they not? And if you're not eligible, there's no changing those rules. You're not in. So don't waste your time applying for a grant that you are not eligible to receive. So that's pretty clear as well. So they're probably the two key things that we would always look at when assessing an organisation to proceed for a government grant. Being competitive means that they are competitive. So you've got to be a good fit. So you want to make sure that you are going to be at the top of the pile. So it's, again, look at the merit criteria, look at the underlying policy, and determining fitment is very important. And we do reputational checks as well on the organisation's directors. So we'll do Google searches and reviews and whatnot, make sure, there's no negative, ATO liabilities or anything like that are floating around that might catch people out. So also making sure that there's a natural alignment for the reputation of the organisation as well.
And so when you say competitive, what's the ratio of applicants to successful applicants? Typically, it must be fairly substantial because people are looking at this and saying, free money, let's have some of that. Yeah,
it's interesting. So in a normal applicant pool, so a standard applicant would have between a 3.5% and 5.5% chance of funding under a grant, and that's on the averages over a decade. So we track the number where we can. It's not always publicly articulated, the number of applicants, but we generally get a bit of a feel for it in each cycle. So we can take some pretty firm estimates. With us, so we've got the data that shows we're 14 times more likely to get funding using Avant Group than a self-applicant. And again, it goes down to it's articulating the narrative correctly, but it's also those assessment checks that we do up front around fitment of the actual project against the merit criteria and the outcomes of the grant. So they are very competitive. So you don't want to waste your time applying for grants that you're not going to win.
So let's just, because I love numbers, let's just drill down on that. So a 3 to 5%. So that basically says that on average, you've got about a 1 in 20 chance. And the reality is a whole bunch of those applicants won't be eligible anyway because people didn't read the eligibility criteria carefully. A whole bunch of those people won't actually meet fitment because they didn't actually understand what that really meant as well. So being in the hands of somebody who writes grants, pre-assesses effectively eligibility and fitment for a day job, that explains why you've got a 14 times more higher success rate than the average Joe or Mary applying online and praying.
That's right.
Which apparently is not a strategy.
Well, it's probably not a smart strategy. It's a strategy, but it may not be one that you should do. So.
Well, it's got at best it's got a 1 in 20 chance, but it might actually be a 1 in 100. or 1 in a million.
I've
So
I've had it before
powerball on a
where,
Saturday night.
yeah, yeah. So I've had it before where I've had businesses come to me and they've explained, oh, we applied for this grant, we didn't get it. And I just look at the business, I go, gee, you're a great fit for this. And tell me about your project. I'm like, project's a great fit. This one makes sense. Like, I don't understand it. And I'm like, send me your application. And then you read it and go, okay, now I know why you didn't get it as
No, that
well.
makes sense. Yeah.
So it's sometimes the fitment's there, but it's not written in the right way. And, I think that'll get better with the advent of, your co-pilots and your chat GPTs of the world. So I think that the quality of the applications will certainly go up.
Yeah.
But again, there's very much it's a nuanced way of articulating a write-up for a competitive grant. So
Yeah, I don't believe that you'll just be able to actually plug the grant criteria into GPT and get it to enunciate carefully something that actually has got a nuance to the policy intent that the government was thinking about when they drafted the grant, which will be the overarching umbrella for eligibility and success.
yeah, I've been trying, but no, you're right.
And so we've now written an absolute cracker of a grant application. Then what happens?
So it gets lodged, and then we just wait. So
what happens in government? Are they doing anything useful with it, or is it just sitting on a pile waiting for the deadline?
So they won't assess them until they've all been put in. But the first
It's closed off.
Yeah. So the window's closed, and then the assessment commences. And the first step's always eligibility. So are they in or are they out? And then at a departmental level, you'll get the department personnel who are the ones that are involved with writing the grant guidelines, etc. They'll do their preliminary assessment, and they'll put a recommendations paper on the front of it, or one pager with how they think it scores. Then it goes to an independent external panel, and this is the most scenario. So not all follow this process, but it's how in the most they occur. The independent panel is selected and paid, and they have a requirement to flag any conflicts of interest. So they'll flag, I can't review this one because I sat on a board for that one, or so they'll exit those that they can't review. But their role is to independently assess the applications with their skills. So they'll align that panel with the sector or the STEM-based area of expertise that the application should be addressing. And then from there, it'll go back to the department, and then it goes to the minister, in most cases if it's a large grant, for ministerial off. So there's a fair process that has to occur there. And that's why, it's a bit tough on government where it takes some time to go through that process because you can't expedite that. So realistically, when you lodge a grant, if you get a response within 3 months, that's a good outcome. But typically it's between 3 and 6 months, which is why I say if you've got critical need for investment, waiting for a grant outcome is not a good idea. You're better off just investing and keep ticking along with the business, whereas grants are perfect for that sort of future thinking. So 6 to 12 months down the track, this is what we're planning and this is what we think we're going to need at that point in time. That's what we should be seeking grant funding for.
So you really need to be thinking well and truly ahead, which is an important part of your strategic planning process anyway. And to be fair from a government perspective, the reality is this is your and my taxpayers' funds.
Absolutely.
And so we do expect a rigorous process for how they're going to actually spend it.
I'm so pleased with the process that the government undertakes, to be honest, because I view it the same. Like, I'm a taxpayer too. So, I think they do a really good job. As I said, I mentioned the Tasmanian government just earlier. They're fast. They review it, they assess it, they critique it, they visit the businesses. It's a busy job to try and make sure that the money's going to where it should be going to, and that people are complying. And then that ongoing management piece, once they've got the funding, they're assessing, they're reviewing the milestones, they're doing the site visits, ensuring that the capital equipment's being put in place. Like, these are all positive steps in making sure the money's going to where it should be.
Yeah. And so then if I'm successful with my grant application, then what happens?
Well, you could pop open a bottle of champagne and you ring me and you go, we got it.
Yeah. So you just get a note in email. Give us your bank details.
Sometimes you'll get a phone call, and I don't know what it is, but I love it. They always do it on a Friday. So a Friday afternoon's like grant day. And I just love it because you're going into the weekend and people are getting their grant agreements on a Friday afternoon, and sometimes we get called. And this is the thing too, the client gets the call before we do.
Yeah.
So, and because they'll ring us and say, we heard you. And I'm like, you'll hear before we do. And they'll get the call, and then we'll get a call. And sometimes there's like this, oh, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. They're flabbergasted. So we didn't think we were going to get it. And I said, well, what did you bring us in for? So that's always the nice bit. And then, so the big thing with the competitive grant is you can't spend the money until you've got a contract. So
Right.
you get your offer, and once you've got your offer, then there's a milestone review and a timing review and a project articulation. So
So
it's
what does
published.
all that mean?
Well, they'll publish, the project overview in public channels.
Yep.
So the client gets the opportunity to make sure they're happy with, the narrative that's been included.
Right.
Sometimes it might be sensitive if it's a defence or space related grant. So we'll review that, make sure that's okay. And then the milestone timing, because we've submitted and then the world ticks on, sometimes we have to readjust the timing of when
Yeah.
the reporting should be put in place and the cash flows and the spend. So all of that can be negotiated, but the general terms of a contract can't be. So
Yeah.
I've had, large scale ASX listed firms, and upfront that they'll say to me, oh, can we get a draft copy of the contract? And I'll say, absolutely, read it, but be happy with it because you're not going to be changing it.
Mm.
So it's one of those, the government just doesn't negotiate on that at all. They'll only negotiate on timings and cash flows. And
Yeah,
sort
well,
of
they don't want to
narrative.
run thousands, literally,
They
of
can't manage
individual
it.
contracts.
Yeah, they couldn't manage the contract review process and the
No.
administration. So then you sign your contract, and then from there, there's often upfront payment. So generally between 20 and 40% to get your project up and running. So that is literally where you go, here's my bank account details, and then the money pops into the bank account. So yeah, that's the process. And then you deliver on it, report or lodge your paperwork along the way, maintain compliance. And at the end, then there's the audit, which is the final sign off. And there's often between 5 and 10% of the final grant payment held for that last report, which is the final financial acquittal. And then you're done.
Mm. Mm. So tell me a bit more about the reporting obligations typically,
So it
because we've
depends again
talked
on.
about those as being sort of a bit of a sharp intake of breath for grant recipients, because if they've not been through it before, it will come as a bit of a shock.
It is, yeah. And I don't want to use the word, but it actually can be a bit scary as well for businesses, because all of a sudden you've got this big contract with the Commonwealth
Yeah.
and you've got to deliver on it. So there's often, there's a lot of discussion along the way around eligible expenditure, line items that we can and can't include. And then also things change. So you might have had plans to purchase a certain type of equipment. All of a sudden that doesn't make as much sense for the business anymore, or that piece of equipment's not available. They've got a lead time now of 18 months. We've got delays. We need to change and vary the contract. So all of that requires constant communication with the government as we deliver on these programs. So the reporting, it can be onerous, but it's generally fairly relative to the scale of the grant that you're getting.
Yeah.
So if you're getting a small energy grant, then we have to upload an invoice and a proof of payments that aligns with what we said we were going to buy. But if you're getting a large-scale multi-million-dollar grant, then there could be monthly or bi-monthly reporting requirements with regular updates to articulate how the project's progressing. So it is fairly relative to the size of the funding we get. Then you get your other programs like your export grants and your R&D Tax Incentive. Not everyone gets an audit, but in the EMDG, it's about 90% get an audit, so it's quite high.
Wow.
So again, there's a very strong documentation case. And EMDG, I think it's something around 70 to 80% of applicants use a consultant, just because of the reporting on that is extremely onerous. So they just like to push it out to an external consultant to manage it for them. So yeah, it can be quite extensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly the R&D record keeping process is quite particular. It's probably a nice way to put it.
It is, yeah. And it's hard. And it's hard too, because it's being legislation. There's no rule saying you've got to keep this and you've got to keep that and you've got to keep that. It's all about substance over form. So, being able to comfortably lodge an R&D claim for a refund of $10 million, well, what documentation would you need to substantiate that? So that's why using an advisor is always a good thing, because they'll work through that documentation set and what's reasonable, and sort of build up that story which can substantiate a claim of that scale. So it's it can be a little daunting sometimes for, I think, companies without support.
Yeah, well, look, a number of my clients have gone down the R&D tax incentive route really over the last sort of 15 years. All of them have ended up using or getting support for their compliance obligations because it's just helped them be compliant. It's been a much simpler process for them. But also there's been times when the businesses have become quite profitable where they've actually looked at it and said, yeah, the compliance obligations are significant and we're not really sure that we actually are going to get sufficient benefit from the R&D tax incentive to make that worthwhile. And the reality is that's a good thing because they've now gotten to the point where they're financially successful enough where they really don't need to be on the government teat, for want of a better description.
Yeah, it's tricky. It is a tricky one, and there's been a review of R&D because yes, I agree. You know, when you're at a scale where the R&D tax incentive isn't making sense for the business, then that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And you know, paying tax is it's not a nice problem to have, but it's a good problem to have in the sense that if you're paying tax, then you're making money, right? Well, that's generally what people say. But I think the only counter to that would be where you're competing globally. So if you've got a global entity and they've got the choice to put research and development activities anywhere in the world, you want our tax incentives to be the attractive spot to do it because otherwise you end up with a brain drain globally. So so there has been a review and we're waiting for the outcome of that review to address that exact issue where businesses, they might be too big or they're too profitable, they don't need the incentive, but then how do you then incentivize them to keep investing in R&D so that they can also forget it? So
which again builds
very fine
our
balancing
sovereign
act.
capability. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a serious co-investment available from government if you're focused on the areas that the government's looking to support in Australia's future. And with that, there are serious obligations that government needs to meet to ensure that they're using the public's funds wisely and justifiably, which places significant and appropriate obligations to the recipient to meet their obligations. As a medium business, Kate, how have you accessed grants in the past? It's a bit like the chef eating their own food.
So we've been fortunate to get some grants along the way. I'd be disappointed if I'd been running this business since 2012 and we hadn't been in access programs. So we've actually been fortunate. So within one of our arms, our research arm, we're now working with some global companies around managing their research and development activities offshore. So the Australian-based legislation is modelled on what they call the Frascati methodology. So it's like an OECD standard for R&D. So we're now sending engineers offshore to support research and development activities for some of those multinationals that may have some operations in Australia and overseas. So we've been able to access the EMDG program, which has been fabulous and amazing support. External to that, we've also got some smaller ones along the way. There was the Small Business Energy Efficiency Grant we mentioned. So that enabled us to take a 27-year-old air conditioning system and replace it at our building with a new fancy HVAC, clean energy, less emitting air conditioning system. So there's been a few programs like that along the way. Professional services is a little trickier to get funding. We haven't accessed the R&D tax incentive, so we haven't really... our R&D work that we've done is been for internal purposes. So we've done some pretty sophisticated software development, but not those that we're going to commercialise external to the business. So we haven't been able to claim that. But maybe one day, you never know. So
At the moment, it's not eligible.
That's exactly right.
Not novel enough.
So we've done it. We've done little bits and bobs along the way. So there's always something. You know, if you're a business and you're employing, there's always something that can be supporting to invest and scale and grow.
If you really want to kick off your strategic planning and work in a supportive environment with other CEOs and leaders, the CEO Masterclass in Strategic Planning and Implementation is for you. This 10-month small group course helps you craft your strategic plan, present it to a group of peer investors, and develop a habit of monthly implementation. Our waitlist is open now at CriticalFewActions.com.au.
So, Kate, if a founder or a CEO, this is the final and probably the most important question. So if a founder or a CEO is looking to start utilising government grant funding in their organisation, what critical few actions should they start tomorrow if they did nothing else?
First thing would be to see what's available.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are thousands of government grants that are available. So you could talk to an advisor. So you can reach out to, you're welcome to contact me if you have, I'm always happy to chat to people and see what might be there for their business. But the first thing is just don't miss out, because if you're not getting grants and your competitors are getting grants, then you're actually at a strategic disadvantage by
Yeah.
not at least applying and giving it a go. And it's it's the it's the old adage, you've got to be in it to win it. So,
Mm.
if you don't apply, then you're definitely not going to get it. So, checking for fitment and making sure that there's alignment, that's important, but also putting your hand up and saying, yep, we're doing the right thing here. We're supporting investment, we're growing, we're scaling. And applying is obviously important too. So I think the first instance, check what is available to you just to make sure you're not missing out as an organisation.
Brilliant. Fantastic. So, Kate, as always, it's been a delight to have a chat with you. Thank you so much for your time on sharing how this all sort of fits into the landscape of small to medium businesses, and that there is significant potential out there, and there's a way through careful consideration of eligibility, fitment, and the way that you present your grant applications of stacking the chairs in your favour.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it.
Super.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Few Actions podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and grab the downloadables from the show notes. And if you found this episode helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you share it with your peers and your team. Stay focused and take action. The Critical Few Actions podcast, including show notes and links, provides general information only and is not individualised business advice, nor can it be relied upon as such. You must take responsibility for your own advice, decisions and actions.